very welcome to session 3. My name is Sheridan. I'm an architect and planner. In my day job I work, I'm the director of Sheridan's Architects and Urban Planners, and we work in the area of urban regeneration, heritage, housing, sustainable communities and collaborative planning in cities, towns and villages. So this is really a fantastic place to be among all of you who are interested in this area, and also then to hear the public challenges that face us, but also what the opportunities are. And I think that we're going to have some solutions here this afternoon as well, which would be really, really good to hear. So this topic, Dublin housing at the end, is the pursuit of a livable city centre, and it resonates so well with the overall theme of the conference, a city in crisis or a golden opportunity. And there really is no greater opportunity than our historic core of our cities and towns as sustainable and beautiful places to live, work, and recreate for all generations. So in this session this afternoon, our speakers will explore the theme of urban beauty, death and life, zombie urbanism, and consideration then of who is Dublin really for. So really stimulating afternoon. So our first speaker is Dr. Paul James Kearns, and I have the honour of being the first person to introduce Dr. Paul, and it's Dr. Paul. Paul is an urban planner, author and journalist with over 20 years working experience in urban regeneration in Dublin's inner city, and I know some of the publications were referred to earlier. He's co-author of Redrawing Dublin 2010 and Beyond Dash, The Puzzle of Dublin 2014, and he recently completed his PhD on mapping urban beauty at the Technicon Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa. So I'm delighted and honoured to hand you over now to Dr. Paul James Kearns on the theme of mapping urban beauty, a public good. Thank you.
So I'll ask the question, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. I think I'm the first planner from the Dublin Council to appear here, so be kind after some sessions. But I no longer work there, so it's okay. So I'm here to talk about mapping urban beauty, a public good. I'm a little bit about myself. I worked as a planner in the City Council for 20 years, primarily in New York City, and for those 20 years I also lived in New York City, North York City. And I'm co-author of the book Redrawing Dublin. And the reason I put that up there today is because the central theme of that book, which I think is very relevant to today, is where decision makers live, what they see, what they don't see, every day affects the priorities for our city. For the last 7 years I've been living in Tel Aviv. As you kind of said, I just recently was awarded my doctorate, and for the last 2 years of that, I've had misfortune of being able to write about the war in Gaza. And I tell you, it's a totally experience to be writing about urban beauty in the morning in Tel Aviv, and then writing about the war in Gaza in the afternoon in Israel. So when I started my research, I asked my then 5-year-old daughter, Ella, what she thought made a beautiful city. And on beauty, she said trees, flowers, colour, decoration, and water. On the lack of beauty, the noise of motorbikes, dog shouting, and people said, I don't love you. And I think after 4 years of research, she's pretty much onto something. So why urban beauty? Halfway through my career in Dublin City Council, I asked my colleagues, had they known that the Irish economy was going to grow at 6.8% on average every year for 15 years, might they have expected a more beautiful city? That was the general reaction from most of my colleagues. Well, what do you mean by beauty? He wants to say aesthetics or something else. But as we've shown earlier today, Dublin City Council does have a vision for the city within the next 10 years, that Dublin will be a beautiful, compact city, etc., etc. But no sooner does the policy effect appear, it never appears again in the entire document, and the world needed to prepare once more. And it's also important to note that the European Balance Programme, as Nikki referred to, really stresses urban beauty, and the word beautiful is in the first line of the programme. So why take on the subject of urban beauty? So my argue it's a crazy thing to do, crazy endeavor. But there are many reasons, and the research identifies tried essentially, or I did with 3 or 4 reasons. Simply beauty is important to cities. There's a beauty premium. Everything from the beauty of the neighborhood to everything from residential stability, economic growth, and community satisfaction. There's also what I call the beauty puzzle. It's kind of a paradox where almost every city in the world has aesthetic policies on everything from building height, design, material finishes, views, etc. But no city, as far as I know, endeavors to take on the thorny subject of trying to map or measure the urban beauty of its own city. And finally, what I call beauty parity, the aesthetic welfare. Who gets what in the beauty states of the city? So for the research, the urban core of Tel Aviv and Dublin was the case study areas, and they were used to model, map, and validate what I call the composite urban beauty index. In the case of Dublin, it was the area inside the canal. So what's a composite index? Well, essentially it's a statistical tool that groups together multiple indicators to present a singular metric of some broader conceptual subject. So probably the most famous, or well-known, I should say, composite index is the Human Development Index of the UN, which uses just 3 variables to measure the complex subject of human development. I whittled down the variables in the urban beauty composite index from 12 to 7. 5 are defined or can be understood as positive and 2 are negative. Green space, tree canopy, listed buildings, which in Tel Aviv includes most modern buildings, so it's not very ancient or historical buildings. Open space and water, and the negatives are vehicular traffic and derivation. Each of those variables were given a different survey of over 200 urban design professionals. You might not agree with the weighting. I didn't, but it was an objective and transparent way of giving the weighting. So they fed into the model. So each of the variables in the literature can be understood as a public good, essentially a public good or a social good. So in economics, a public good or social good, a collective good, is a product or service that is non-excludable, non-rivalous, used by one person rather than its access by other people in order to reduce availability to others. So probably the most well-known public goods we talk about in the literature, or people know or understand, is a clean air or a lighthouse. So essentially, if these 7 variables can be conceived or some metric allows for some meaningful measurement of urban beauty, then we can conceive urban beauty as a public good. And actually, there's some emerging literature, particularly in the EU, which is doing so. So essentially, the model uses a variety of GIS tools to generate a urban score for the entire area inside the canal. And a different potential score is generated for every 20 by 20 meter cell. And I guess the model can be understood as a probability model of encountering urban beauty. And I like this quote from the mathematician George Box, that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Essentially, a PhD is the battle between truth and usefulness. The model can be calibrated, you can add dozens more variables, but then obviously the calculation and the research required to do that makes it useful. So without going into the weeds, it's based on fuzzy logic, which is a research approach that details the problems related to ambiguous, subjective, imprecise judgments and degrees of truth. And I think all those words are perfectly applicable to beauty. So to validate the urban beauty index, rather simple, the scores of the city or the map are correlated with ratings of photographic imagery of that area. To do that, we asked some 90 students, 89 students in 3 universities to rank hundreds of views, 12,000 ratings in work presentations of images, and to rate them either simply beautiful, imagery, or not beautiful. The model basically, thankfully, for the amount of time I put into it, the model basically held up substantially. So in the most beautiful areas, over 2/3 of the images were already beautiful and just 8% not beautiful. In the least beautiful areas, again, almost 2/3 were already not beautiful, beautiful. And in the intermediate areas, in the complexity and expectation, plurality were rated in between, with a nice even divide around the third area of the side. So just to look at some of the most high rated images in Dublin, these are the highest rated images, beautiful, the most beautiful areas. And sometimes PhD, paying for PhD before there's no food obvious. A lot of greenery in all those images. In the images rated least beautiful, I guess the complexity of the urban environment was greater. And finally, some of the images rated in between. These are in the intermediate areas. So this is a plurality or slight majority are rated in between. And you can see in these images why there might be a diverse opinion. Historic fabric, vast car park. Some trees, again, extensive tarmac avenue sector. The docklands, water. So when we drill down, or I drill down to the lowest rated images in the model, what I found was there was a lot of unattractive walls and fences in Dublin imagery. And so this got me thinking there's a possibility that the variables that form the index are predictors of characteristics not measured by the index, walls and fences, is not a variable, which magnify the positive or negative aesthetic rating of the image. So in other words, there's a kind of urban law attraction going on. And there's evidence again in the literature, and having worked at 20 years in terms of council, I can give evidence too, that municipal authorities are more tolerant, or less beautiful, or less desirable planning and management outcomes in areas they perceive, or the public perceive as less beautiful. The missing variables, as I said, there's endless, infinite amount of missing variables, potentially a huge number. Maintenance is an obvious one. It's an onerous task, obviously, to generate data on the maintenance of every single building in the city and it can change in hours. More abstract variables that try and capture happiness, joy, before it takes place. And I guess architecture with capital A. Great architecture, dare I say it, is rare. And architecture is also very contested, particularly between the professionals and the public. And then the elephant in the room in Dublin, particularly north of the city, is antisocial behaviour, which is, I still kind of talked about, not enough, and the problems that it doesn't. But a very difficult issue, or a difficult issue to talk about, a very difficult issue to map and measure in any model. So the policy implications, there are potentially many. I'm just going to briefly talk about four. The first one is transparency, knowledge, and power. What's the data that's informing the model? I'll just go through a little bit of that. There are 6 persons per street tree in South George and Cork. There are 103 persons per street tree in parts of the north of the city, and the various that's work. There are 58 persons per hectare of green open space in South George and Cork. In some parts of the South George, it's over 36,000 for green open space equivalents. Second policy implication is that we conceive beauty as a public good, then we have a responsibility to map it and to map neighbourhoods in the city to understand the city. So again, as I said earlier, the model shows the scores of a cell of 20 by 20 metres was very fine grained. The image on the left is northwest of our city, Henry Street. The image on the right shows a college. Obviously scored by time. Can everything look like Trinity College? Obviously not. Should everything look like Trinity College? Of course not. But that was the point. Third policy implication is environmental justice or remedial action. So just take the case of first contact street trees as an example. How do we make that decision? Who makes that decision? So Usher's key area, the Grantham Basin, both have the comparable street tree per person, which is about 20% below the city's average. But maybe we should be looking at street trees instead of looking at planted street trees. We should have more a concept of urban beauty as public good infrastructure with what I call integrated multi-criteria. So maybe we should take into account air pollution. And one metric, Usher Street is almost 10 times worse off in terms of air pollution than the Grand Canal Basin. The fourth policy implication is the potential to integrate with other city planning objectives. So I take the case of densification. South Georgian Core, which we all accept as one of the most beautiful parts of the city, has the lowest density of population in the city, and it's not simply because there's parks there. Actually, nobody lives there. And Summer Hill, which doesn't score well in the world, has one of the highest densities of population in the city. So one potential obvious conclusion in relation to sustainability is let's make beautiful areas more dense, and let's make dense areas more beautiful. Now, in the last census, I was kind of shocked to find this out, that despite the low density of population in South Georgia Core, and the increase of population in the canal area since the last census, population fell by 20%, 22%. So we're certainly not making the most beautiful areas more dense. Summer Hill increased by maybe 40%, and I don't know whether yet some of them will live. So, ultimately, urban beauty as a public good is about a livable city. And that gives me a little segue into the Dublin Civic Task Force. One of the core objectives of the task force is to encourage more people to live in the city centre. Unfairly, perhaps, I would give a word count on the document. And words like workers, work, development, nighttime economy, culture, etc., all appear quite frequently. Children appears twice, playground twice, trees, not at all, parks, not at all. They don't include car parks, but parks not. And I can expect urban beauty or aesthetics to appear. But maintenance, not those. You see, 10,000 words. So, the task force has 10 big moves. The big move 8 is to offer Dubliners a compelling reason to visit the city centre. I would add number 11. Offer Dubliners compelling reasons to want to live, not be forced to live, as in the unfortunate housing situation in the North Georgia Core, or continue to live, want to live in the city centre. So I'll just finish with this image that was in the Irish Times, the article written by Michael McDowell, and it says, no other European city will tolerate the decay and dereliction visible in Dublin. And I'd just like to add my decade-old hobby horse. I don't think any other great European city would be decision makers that that's who choose not to live in the centre of the city. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I think it was plenty to think about. I think it's something that really ties in with the discussion previously about governance, about what will make the city centre a desirable place to live, and what those points are very just being so important to that. And to follow, we are going to be joined with Dr. Gavin Daly. Gavin's going to explore the concept of zombie urbanism and its relevance to Dublin's urban transformation. I think it fits very well with Paul's discussion as well. Gavin is a qualified planner and a former Irish government specialist advisor on planning, architecture and climate change policy. He has over 20 years of wide-ranging experience as an urban planning policy advisor throughout Europe, and also lectures at Technological University of Dublin. So I'll hand you over now to Paul.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So, bear with me, this is the first time I've given a presentation, so something completely different. We have heard this morning about kind of normative vision of what the city should be from Paul, and kind of good design, urban design, beautiful aesthetics, etc., etc. But for 20 years of working as a planner and 20 years of disappointment, and my recent research is mostly focused on structural dynamics and the circuits of capital which are underneath the whole process of urbanisation and what the actual purpose of urbanisation is, which is not what we think. So I'm going to start today by, I'll just use this. By, in the first instance, by effectively committing what we might call secular blasphemy in Ireland, is questioning the whole notion of supply. Because that's something which you don't think about. So if there's any economists in the audience today, you might be pushing your pearls to leave now, which is not like anything you can say. Is there any economists in the audience? Exactly. No economists there. There's really the power to shape the urban environment. It's not in this room. Okay? It's in the economics profession. They're on our radios, they're on talk shows, they're on weekend talk shows. They are the people who are driving the urban environment. So we are just playing around with our interests and all passionate about the urban environment, but the actual structural dynamics are elsewhere. So these might seem like kind of slightly obtuse comments in the context of where we are today, but believe me, you know, the whole idea that the supply is the answer to all our problems, the elixir that cures all ills, it's just a universal, natural, unquestionable common sense. Okay, so we don't need academics here like me coming here and saying that you need to question supply, we need to get on the building, we need to get on the buildings, we need to get pragmatic solutions. But ultimately, these discourses, the hidden power that these discourses have in shaping the kind of normative perceptions of what the city should be and what it could be are absolutely critical. Okay, and they're the root cause of the current crisis. So they embed a certain ideology in our planning institutions, in all of our social institutions, in our media, everything. Okay, and it's what you might call a kind of form of secular groupthink. Okay, remember at the end of the financial crisis, we all talked about the NIBR report about overconfidence, suppression of dissenting voices, questions, assumptions, and models, desire for consensus, pressure to conform, very difficult to consider alternative views and visions. These kind of uncritical beliefs absorbed in society create a kind of common sense. What we need is actually a good sense. Okay, critical, coherent, more reflective thinking, rooted in lived experience and even potentially transformed. So, my whole thesis and the argument I'll make today is that unless we question the whole hegemony which supplies our urban development, the whole narrative around it, and particularly the dominance of the economics profession in urbanization processes, okay, we're never going to solve this crisis. And I use the word crisis because I actually don't think we have to have a crisis at all. Actually, our housing system is working precisely as it's intended to. Okay? So we don't have a crisis. Right? These, in terms of these type of narratives, these underlying narratives, structure kind of what's called zombie urbanism. Right? And this is a concept used by Professor Johnny Aston in Oslo about kind of the urban environments which have been designed today driven exclusively by speculative corporate profit and gentrification. Okay? And so often this whole idea of Ulrich Beck's, the late German philosopher, people feel about the zombie concept, ideas which are alive in our heads. Okay? These have urban maxims, compact growth, smart development, creative cities, entrepreneurial, it's all very dynamic. But ultimately, these metaphors are metaphors what we call metaphor zombies. They obscure the reality of what's happening in the city today. Okay, so basically like dead concepts, which continue to walk, like living dead, they're like our heads and our language, but not any longer useful for predicting precise propositions about what the reality of the city is today. So, what follows from that, from my research, is that if we want to change what's happening in the city, fundamentally, we need to change how we talk about the city. What type of language we use. This is not just a trifling issue, it's actually fundamental. I'll explain why. So, the common narrative of the entire system, the fact that we've got to get planning bureaucracy out of the way. Okay? The primary crisis is supply, open bureaucratic restrictive planning system, pushes up costs, lots out generating value from home ownership. This is the official story of the housing crisis. Okay? So the whole idea here, all the time. And every late night talk show talks about supply. We all know the answer to problem supply. The government's always wants to ramp up supply, so in the Planning Act recently, National Time Framework, 60,000 houses, 70,000 houses, 80,000 houses, how many houses you have to get once. Okay? This whole idea of a housing czar, this guy, always a man, could come in and kick down doors and knock heads together. Everybody is going to build, maybe build, and just get all the bureaucracy and petty regulations out of them. Okay? And so, but when you look at the reality of the situation, it's a difficult reality to sustain. This whole narrative of the argument, if you look at the 4 Dublin housing supply pipeline quarterly results, this is a little bit out of date now, but we have 78,000, over 78 new homes permitted in Dublin on 406 development sites. Okay, 83% of them are apartments. Okay, there's a total of almost 50,000 permitted uncommenced units on 207 inactive sites. There are ongoing judicial reviews and actually just 14 schemes. So this whole narrative about judicial reviews, stopping everything, and all these pesky homeowners, blocking development, okay, is a tiny fraction, and it's always been a tiny fraction. Okay, since the new LRD process, as the large-scale residential process came in, there's about 10,000 units granted, of which, as at the time of this, 114 units were built, and 2,500 under construction. And the SHD process, 35,000 units currently permitted, of which there are 2,588 units built. That's a big story, we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, we know the data, you can see the data. Now I know data around housing is, and we'll talk more about this, can be a little bit sketchy, but you can see that the blue line shows the total number of permitted units, and the yellow bars are the total number of units under construction, and the grey is the total permitted but not yet commenced. Okay, so by any objective measure, Dublin does not have a planning permission supply problem. Okay, we know what all the sites are, so you can go online, you can interrogate them, investigate them, you can see where they all are, all the inactive sites, etc. Okay, but the narrative persists. This is the teacher recently. It's clear to me from the discussions I've had with various government departments and officials respective, it has a question that we need to pivot more strongly. Getting private sector investment into the market. Really? Pivot more strongly. Okay? Since the collapse of Credit Tiger, State total vast portfolios of distressed land, property assets, not down prices to property investors. Introduced real estate investment trust with zero tax payable or rental income. Introduced the now abandoned disastrous housing development system. I'll say more about that. Urbanism with lower bills for rental apartment standards and niche co-living, most recently waived development contribution levies. Okay, and there's even been talk recently about should be reducing tax incentives. And some people mentioned that this morning. Or the Heritage UCD says the subsidy per apartment is now about €150,000. Okay? So we bent over backwards to make housing market more attractive to private capital. Since 2014, prices have risen by 150%. Rents have skyrocketed to keep unsustainable levels. Home ownership has declined sharply. Sponsors have risen to record highs. Property value of property is stored. As it reaches the plateau, there will be up to, as I just mentioned, about 50,000 uncommenced planning permissions in Dublin alone. So at some point, you might want to ask the question, I know this is not a popular thing to say, that actually increasing the demand for housing as an investment asset is very far from being the solution, but actually the source of the problem. Okay? This kind of city-first supply-side urban development, so-called Manchester model, is really influenced by new economic geography, which is kind of neoclassical, orthodox economic geography, which is all driven by the clustering development of city centres, the key needs of boosting productivity, and meet the needs of high-skilled knowledge economy. This is Dublin, okay? Just in Manchester is effectively the same model as Dublin. It's all about increasing urban property development investment into property assets. Okay, and planning is ultimately relaxed, in order to drive development, incentivise, all about viability. Okay, supporters of this whole model argue that by attracting private investments to central residential property assets to draw skills, finance, and technology from the outside. Attracting private real estate investment in the city centre is an end in itself. Presence of cranes and skyscrapers on skylines catch up and measure success. The most What we're missing in this whole thing is that we're focusing on investment bidding, but we're not looking at what's going out of the city. Okay? So the whole model is characterized by a process of resource centralization and extraction. Okay? So while real wages and positively do rise, rising rents and mortgage payments consume increasing proportion of after-tax income, meaning that the benefits of wage gains are effectively captured by property developers. This suggests an urban model that is works for investors in working households. So we see this in Dublin, and a lot of the discussion has is exactly this. Okay? This inward and upward process of centralization is actually concentrating economic multipliers in terms of capital rather than circles of the demand of urban centres. This pulls in skills and capital, and primary industry sector heating up the housing market in the city, driving gentrification. So property gains that flow through households are effectively captured by real estate investors via rising rents, which are funneled into regions, tax havens, or otherwise, before being cycled eventually back into new development to begin the process again, normally in different cities around the world. This core urbanization of capital is a global phenomenon. It's what we're missing out of the debate here. We focus on developments in Dublin, but the reality is that this is we're just one location alone in the global phenomenon of urbanization of capital. Okay? Some of this, of course, is recycled locally in services, property management, development, etc. Trickle down, effectively. So there is insufficient, but where there's insufficient effort to recoup these values, such as the drop in the development contribution levies, then developers and investors capture the wider benefits obtained from them development. So these effectively kind of Keynesian demand multipliers, they're supposed to materialise, because private consumption is capped by rising housing costs reducing government spend, but industry multipliers are creating fewer new business opportunities. Okay, so this kind of model that we're totally focused, as Taoiseach earlier said, on private investment in, totally ignores the whole idea of how much money is leaving the country via this whole urban development model. Kind of creates a kind of Edmund Village kind of effect which transfixes the media and public debate about urban development, where oppressive transportation from the skylines rely on relatively untransformed household experiences. So, this kind of rapid house building plus abstractions about urban agglomeration and market forces kind of zombie concept ignore the extractive rights, effectively the contractual rights for profit handed over in the process. The focus on supply side investment ignores the counterpoint. Investment always expects a return, and by focusing exclusively investment in, the right to take money out are obscured. The money out matters because it raises a completely different set of questions. And we all kind of know this, but anybody at a certain age, they monopoly when they're younger. And people don't realise that monopoly is actually derived from the landlord's game, which was people that studied Henry George. Effectively, it was a way of teaching people how the whole notion of Georgian period works. Effectively, everybody knows the game of monopoly is about making all your opponent bankrupt. That's the whole idea of it. Okay? And the economists have known this, especially neoclassical variation, which most of our economists in the country stem from, because it's the orthodoxy. So you understand that any country has a holding from private property, landlords like older men love to reap where they never sowed and demand rent for its natural produce. Adam Smith, famous quote about the whole idea of why landlords are bad. Okay, ultimately, and are drag on capitalism. But this seems to be forgotten by kind of modern contemporary economics. And Marianne Mazzucato and Christopher's have all spoken about this. The whole purpose of urbanization is not about development, it's about making money, ultimately. It's the urbanization of capital. Okay, so ultimately the whole gentrification supply nexus is basically exposed to the approach of originally conflicting needs of society with needs of capital, so it's legitimized conditions for maximizing profit to conquer and shape urban space, the short-run priorities of finance, capital, of economic and political elites, and those power situations which are not unique to Ireland, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world. Okay? The economists from the social development was unique about this kind of urban rubbish dynamics, which was offered in the 1970s. Okay? And this whole idea of economic rent has been long been forgotten about the classical urban economics. And this is what's happening in our urban society today. This is fundamental to what we talk about. Everything else we talk about, unification, development, etc. Unless we understand the structural economics at play, it's all about financialization. Okay, so one thing I find really interesting about this whole idea is sleep regulation. Okay, property developers will build, baby build, and all that happens ever after. It's kind of closely associated with the kind of global union movement, which has become a big thing online about development. So property is unique, it's a dual function. Consumption is a commodity, we only live somewhere. Okay, it's also not. Okay, so arguments that base on supply are just hugely plausible because they focus attention on physical ability from your housing stock. But explanations of the housing price facing supply are low or flawed because they conflate housing size as a commodity with the lowest income generation assets. If you think about it, roughly 2/3 of global asset values are invested in property. Okay, about 287 trillion, 3 times global GDP. So by any objective measure, property is by far the biggest store of global wealth. And everybody in this room who owns a home knows this. Your biggest store of global wealth is your home. And nobody wants their property price to go down. Investors don't want their property price to go down. Does anybody think investors want low property prices? Anybody seriously think that if the government sweep away all burdens of planning and regulation, then the developers will build more? Well, why would they do that? This will be inimical to their own economic interest. Their interest is based on keeping supply scarce. This has always been the way. It's ultimately what's called the absorption rate. So pretending that somehow market forces can achieve this is basically flawed. As concluded in the UK Government report, the absorption rate will always be the primary requirement of the new market supply. As soon as prices start to fall, supply will be moderated accordingly. You can see this pricing all the time. I live in Luxembourg. When post-COVID price started to flow, you see all the buildings that stopped. Okay? Nobody's building anymore because they want to build it because property prices are going down. Why would you want to do that? Okay? So this regularization or financialization basically encapsulates a broad shift where housing is rural assets which are primarily viewed as sources of income to actually through rents. And I recommend the Local Josh Buying Conference and texting this whole housing finance feedback where increased financial flows into housing and household debt results in rising house prices and land values, increased demand for property financial assets, developing a small low interest rate, more measures, financial deregulation, and innovation, release, capital markets, tax-friendly home investor policies, global home purchase subsidies, big thing in Ireland, with the help to buy, etc. And linking no-market, non-ownership housing offers. So actually, the proportion of people who are homeowners actually starts to go down. Ironically, in Anglo-Saxon countries, we all know about this. Anglo-Saxon countries which are property owning democracies where the whole welfare system is built on you owning a home, property ownership is actually going down in these countries. Okay? And most of it's been siphoned off by monopoly man into global networks of capital investment and taking off into tax havens or countries. Okay, so how does this manifest in urban environments? Okay, keep talking here, sometimes and stuff. So we see this shift into this kind of idea of zombie urbanism as it's called. Okay, kind of we end up with this kind of paradoxical path of urban development, and many people captured this morning. So that's the whole idea, where you see kind of new glass towers, domination, rising cheap hotel by boarding up shop fronts, opposite there, Richard and Decay, next to these rising tower blocks. This is the it was proposed to be the common quarter down your Comedy Station. I only live up the road, so it's a site that I'm particularly interested in. It's a good example of this kind of whole idea of generalized gentrification, which capitalizes on investment banks, developers, and state actors, which should be shaping entire urban areas for profit. So instead of taking the needs of residents as a departure, developers and politicians have simply copied the most typical success factors from the world. These type of ideas, this kind of homogeneous architectural forms you see in many of these ideas, mostly taken from ideas from abroad. So all these, this is a page of the master plan, and you see them kind of this homogeneous universal architecture which you see in every city you go to. Okay, this is closely related, of course. planners call neoliberalisation of urban development. They shift from managerial to entrepreneurial modes of urban governance. Self-funding urbanism, increasingly prevalent phenomenon growth trend contemporary urban development, cliche-like way many developers and designers talk about and deal with urban environments. Increasingly homogenous discourse, globally speaking, and believe important features of the so-called creative city in Richard Florida, which has been outdated, trying the city, and all motivated around that urban competition. Dublin's a competition with London, Manchester, Copenhagen, etc. It's all about driving inward investment. We're focused on world-class institutions, cultural institutions, state-of-the-art architecture and well-designed public spaces, making the city more attractive to outsiders rather than the needs of the global population. One of the kind of key aspects of this is kind of like a stage urbanization where visualization has been used. So there's no, effectively in these types of urban spaces, no room for irregularity and unexpected, a well-designed, neat, tedious urbanism based on the simplest understanding of urban, providing ideal aspirations about creating living and people-friendly cities. Use of public squares with just the right amount of light and didn't have people hanging around with their bicycles. All creative people, very different minority backgrounds in these illustrations. And effectively, all about commercialization and having the manipulation of the organisation of capital. These visualizations are really important. This one particularly, because it's a good idea of how this kind of zombie urbanization is kind of spreading and kind of creeping across the city. This is the Hamilton site on Common Street, and you can see how what's planned, the complete the destruction of the kind of historical building line on Common Street. This kind of tedious, kind of homogenous land urbanization spreading across the entire city. Public space is a way of kind of legitimizing this. So basically these visualizations are really useful because they find out all the fantastic urban qualities of the development of the Princeton neighbourhood, such as any objection to criticism that people might have are also correct. Who could be against this beautiful new development? Who could be, if you are, you're NIMBY, you're opposed to it, this is better than nothing, etc. Such form of urban design might seem as improvements, but ultimately are damaging in that they block more creative ways of going about making public space. Instead of taking on the challenge of really improving the urban environment and involving people and working seriously with how to make places that are both socially mixed and inclusive, one's helped to establish urban design solutions often described by international consultancies. Okay, so everything, this is what I mean by zombie urbanism. Everything looks nice and urban, but in terms of social life, it is broader, sterile idea. I took a walk down, I did Docklands, took a walk down Docklands, and this, I also often find Docklands has this kind of weird theory, kind of atmosphere at night time where it's surprisingly full but empty at the same time. You walk around, it's just dull. Okay? Soulless, I think the word, boring. Where the dull compulsion of economic and political space emerged towards the elimination of all differences. So ultimately, the same type of urbanisation you see in Dublin, you see it in London, you see it in Manchester, you see it in various cities. Where I live in Luxembourg, Kirchberg, it's the exact same. Glass towers, the same type of urbanisation. So, just some more examples of the kind of paradox, busy with empty, branded urbanism over authentic culture, disconnection from local identity, Instagrammable but in personal spaces. The High Line is a perfect example of comedy culture in terms of the High Line, which I find one of the most kind of emblematic features of gentrification. Property land values increase, long-term residents, small businesses are pushed out, the area becomes wealthier and diverse, new buildings cater to high-income occupiers, that local community, the neighbourhoods, original character and social fabric is what's to be eroded and lost. And then we see this in Dublin. You can see this kind of bubbling under the surface. Dublin is dying, say the cobblestone. Cobblestone is a good symptomatic idea of this whole area where they're watching the build one of these grand hotels, the art hotels, a Vichy or whatever, red brick thing, kind of cantilevered over the pub. And kind of the whole community networks, culture, memory, heritage, affordable community spaces, the Dublin's distinctive urban DNA are being ultimately eroded. So, like all academics, I'm really good at diagnosing problems, I think I'm not very good at solutions. But I would say that language matters. How we talk about this, just buying into these ideas about supply-side urbanization, we need to put these questions, we need to be critical. I'm just saying not along in time somebody says the only supply is the answer to the problem. You know, what is the problem? Or is it the answer to the problem? Changing the discourse moves the place of urban development away from abstract assertions about markets and questions about flows, distributions, and resource allocation. Ultimately, what the purpose of urbanisation is actually for. We can also then examine how we want to create an attractive from or better local communities in the wider region. So whether are we, is the form of urbanisation we're creating actually creating new local community, or is it being sequestered out of the region to other locations around the world, and it's driving inequalities and gentrification, universal gentrification. And we see that with inequality, with kind of right-wing populist backlashes and revenge of places that don't matter, and areas of discontent in society. So I'll finish there, and I've got more to say, but I think I've been quiet. But what I would say is, many of what I just proposed there is these price opposite of what Taoiseach said. This is why this will never happen. We need to actually decelerate the demand for housing sector investment, on financial assets, we need for rent controls, land value taxes, making more efficient use of existing housing stock, and provisioning a significant pool of non-market decommodified housing options. And what I would say is, we don't talk about supply, we talk about education, we don't talk about supply, we talk about healthcare, we don't talk about supply, any of these things, we talk about provision. We talk about housing provision, how we provide enough housing for our people. Not about the supply of housing, because it just gets corrupted by market interests and also the things used to drive property agenda. So I'll leave it there.
I think actually it's really interesting in terms of Gavin talked about finding, begin to analyse and maybe be lighter on solutions. But remember the fact I think that there was solutions there in the way that you spoke about that need for creativity. One of the key words I took from Gavin speaking about finding creative ways, and I think that really picks up on the discussion in relation to the new European Bauhaus and this sort of like cultural shift in the way that we talk about our places and the way that we talk about how we create our places, and maybe a little more activism in terms of how it is we engage with communities and who it is participating in that delivery. So plenty of time to ask any questions or to discuss the topic a bit later. But now I'm delighted to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Sirr. Lorcan will focus again on housing and interestingly too on that narrative on housing and the way we talk about housing at the moment. Lorcan's title is Who is Dublin Really For? Lorcan is a senior lecturer at TU Dublin, as well as a visiting professor of housing at the University of Galway. He writes regularly nationally and internationally on housing and related issues for major publications, including the Irish Times. So I'll hand you over to that and over now to Lorcan. Thank you.
Thanks, Sirr. Gavin stuff is so spot on. I know it's probably a little bit maybe at the edge of some of your roommates, because they're near on windows and that, but his stuff is really good. An Australian guy said to me, he's a happy Australian accent, but when you hear the word the market, he says, oh, Lorcan, just think of rich people with yachts, right? Every time you hear that the word the market means this, you just think, no, this is we're talking about really rich people with yachts. And that's, if you kind of find like that, some of the stuff starts to make a lot more sense. So, I call my talk Who is Dublin Really For, which sounds like a little bit petty and nationalist. I'm going to maybe even change and say, well, what is Dublin for? And what I really meant is not us and them, but like, is it essentially a place of assets and utilization, or is it a place where we want to live and want people to live and have homes? And increasingly it's not one or the other, as far as I can see. Probably what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to do, I haven't seen Gavin's presentation before, is maybe put a spatial spin on what Gavin was talking about, and maybe there's one on the screen too. There's more in favourite photographs of Dublin from 1963, a Dutch photographer. I'm sure most of you have seen it all, seen it before. One of the interesting, so I just want to talk about the shaping of Dublin, and then this idea of how you look outside Dublin to see actually what's happening inside Dublin, who shapes the city, who kind of hits the narratives. Politics of the city is really interesting, and then just kind of where we're going to go from there. Dublin, an interesting place in my mind because it's been shaped primarily, of course, by shaping a lot of modern cities, European cities. You know, the alleviation of poverty, people coming to cities for employment, the development of public transport, all that kind of stuff. That's shaped Dublin as much as it shapes other ones. But also it's shaped by things we can see in contemporary Europe, like a huge anti-urban through things like local authorities and civil services effectively. There's a total anti-urban idea. You see the things like the National Planning Framework as well. As far as like you see Daly back saying we'll have no Manchester, no Birmingham's here. You know, totally anti-urban. And this populist anti-urbanism is ingrained in politics. You see it in the law to this day. You see a lot of the rural reform TVs and all that kind of stuff. And mainstream TVs, you know, kind of parroting along with, you know, why can't we have what Dublin has, forgetting the fact that Dublin pays for your, you know, primary schools and your roads, your bypasses and your traffic lights everywhere else down there. So, you know, taking a couple of hours out of reason in Dublin is not going to make the car go any faster. And also this kind of stuff gets, I mean, you see it like a long time ago that we haven't developed youth, like a lot of people know much more than me. In 1930, and I picked 1930 as my house, I heard it in the house was built in 1930, so I go back and I looked at the deeds and go, what happened in 1930? The average lifespan was less than 60. In 1930, we had 24 big industries, 4 against the 2 big ones. The economic backbone was the large farmer. The solution to our economic problems was to reduce taxes on big farmers. This is exactly the same thing. You know, a deregulation and a reduced taxation thing. And we were just 4 years after the last famine in Ireland. A lot of people didn't know the last famine in Ireland was 1926. So this gets, all this kind of ethos gets reflected in what we build here. And I don't need to talk to this audience about kind of these kind of plants. And even though we built 5,000 of those, we had this very near my own house in Canada, we built an awful lot of those as well. And it was good. You know, so 12 houses a year, very low density, but they work, you know, and at the church in the middle of the boys' school, the boys' school, the girls' school, all named after rural areas or saints, front garden, back garden, bedrooms, all that kind of stuff, you know, I do. And when planning emerges as a profession, Daly referred to it as a seductive profession. And I think it meant that it's seductive in that, you know, not a power if you're a planner, and it's seductive in an attractive profession if you want to do it about. So there's a mistrust and misunderstanding and generally indifference to planning. And like Gavin said in 2004, there's little opportunity for planning to demonstrate or to develop its balanced approach in terms of economic, social and aesthetic. I think that we've been talking about this all day so far, and I think that's well on. And I think planning is still regarded as an affront to power, whether that's political power, or individual power, or civil service power, whatever way you want to do it. I think planning is still regarded as that kind of, in that kind of sense. So we've got some of the same forces, the pursuit of employment and all that. We also, the city is shaped by an anti-city ethos. It's why you kind of don't care. Once a building is built, who cares what it looks like? Do you hear Jack Chambers used to saying people shouldn't be complaining about on aesthetic grounds? You know, this is the man who objected to a remake in his own constituency. Like that kind of, he's a clever guy. That kind of basic stuff. It's beneath him to say things like that, but obviously not. And we have this anti-industry economic policy as well, large farming and the religious influence. You see that on the way houses were designed in schools and all that kind of stuff. And very much the preference over the individual over communality. That still prevails today. That we don't do communality very well. It's all about the individual. It's classic conservative kind of way of doing things. And the planning is prioritised. We wrote Dublin as well. We don't have our own power. We part of this new plan, new church, transport for London, all that kind of stuff. The power that they have over there. So Dublin is shaped by kind of competing forces. But what I mean by to look in is like what's going on in the city at the moment. And to find out what's going on in the city, we kind of need to look at what isn't going on in the city. So one of the things that's shaping the city at the moment is you know, this idea of power and participation. And for all the talk myself, earlier on, you know, the European Bauhaus and inclusivity and participation. Actually, Ireland is the 3rd worst country in Europe for public participation in planning. I don't make that up. That comes from academic research in Delft. We're the 3rd from bottom, and if we planning without that, I think we're going to move to the 2nd last worst in Europe. So that shapes the city because the narrative is anti-planning and you shouldn't be, you know, the countries that get the most traction for their infrastructure and their housing and all that other countries that have the most public participation, not the least. And we're going the opposite way because we kind of led with another industry in many respects. So the density is a big one that comes up all the time. This is back in 2003, or 22 years ago. The density of person per hectare DCC is comparable with Grantstown of the name. That's the DCC thing 20 years ago. It's a lot more now. So I went and I looked in Europe to see how does Ireland compare in terms of density. How do we live? How do we make that density happen? And I looked at, picked out, just they happen to be on top of each other, Ireland and the Netherlands to see how they manage this. And what you see is in the Netherlands, so the Netherlands, go look at this, right? The Netherlands, really interesting country. The Netherlands, 17.5 million people. If you draw a line from here to the M6 in Galway, everything below that is the size of the Netherlands. That's it. And it has 3.5 times our population living from Athenry into Baltimore. So do they build high? Well, you think they would, wouldn't you? Because we've got so many people living on so little. Terrace housing in the Netherlands is 41%, in Ireland is 19%. Semi-detached in the Netherlands is 14%, in Ireland is 24%. Actually, semi-detached and terrace housing is more than half of the housing in the Netherlands than is there. They don't do high roads. Actually, we don't travel around most Europe. I lived and traveled around a lot of Europe. We do an awful lot of one-off housing, surprisingly. We do it in cities more than in the countryside, but they do an awful lot of that. They don't build high, they achieve density by doing things like this. Some of this reminds me of like Sutton in the 1970s and 80s, some of these kind of houses. I would live in all these, no problem, all day long, right? That's medium to high density. It's not high rise. And they live like this, and you go to Almere, it's like Amsterdam, you can buy your own plot and build your own house and all that kind of stuff. So that's the way they achieve density, not the way we do. We do it like this. American prison style. Long, dark, narrow corridors. Now all bought by approved housing bodies and Dublin City Council and everybody else to create ghettos in the future with huge management issues coming down the line, whatever it is. We were told we never have 100% social housing again after Liveable and all that kind of stuff. And here they are buying up, a huge proportion of these things, effectively bailing out to the developers. So we get that, which is part of development down in Observatory Gardens. We get this, so after a long day working in wherever you're working in, Arch Church or DCC, and come home and there's a bottle of Pinot Grigio in the fridge, and you're saying, mad for a drink, 21 degrees roasted inside. And you come in and you ring your front door. What does your front door hit off? You're in bed. And we think that's okay in the interest of density. And then you say the next flat, then your neighbours in next door, and you go to bed in a room with no natural light. And we think that's okay in the interest of density. I don't think that's okay. And then you go to the UK, and this is Goldsmith Street, which won the prize, what do you call it, the Sirr prize, architecture prize, a few years ago, social housing. They have the luxury of 55 square metres, and the front door and the back door and windows around the place, and natural windows. And I don't see why we can't do that. And actually, it's 3-story housing, so this is beautiful. It's 3-story housing, so we have loads of architects in this room, you know well. It's a lot easier and cheaper to phase it as a developer. You can build it, it's a lot cheaper to do that. Instead, we're still looking at 600 units per hectare and all that kind of stuff. Those Street is 83 units per hectare. That's beautiful. It's really, really nice. And of course, the impact then on all this kind of this drive for supply, and Gavin is spot on about the whole supply issue. We don't need 484,000 houses in the country. The main driver that's changed then is that scheme output since 2017. I picked this because it started with Simon Coveney's reign, and we really learned Simon Coveney, I refer to my days in academic journalism, one day at a press conference. So the drivers have changed, so I bring them up every time I can ever since. The drivers have changed. Scheme housing is up nearly 100%, which is great. Single housing is up 30% since 2017, which is grand. Apartments are up 426%. And of course, 95% of the apartments that are built are not for sale. And that is a big issue. And of course, in DCC in 2024, 95% of all the new housing with apartments and affordable prices with the vast majority of them are not for sale. And that has a huge implication because we're one of those Anglo-Saxon countries where we have a thing called asset-based welfare. The state helps you acquire your property, and that's your wealth, pretty much. When you retire on a modest pension, you can live rent-free for the rest of your days, happy with no mortgage, and you can live like a 240 or whatever it is that you do. And that's the way our system is. So this kind of impact on apartments means that effectively what's happening here is that there's a huge proportion, as housing output rises, not 40,000, not 30,300. As as housing stock rises, there's a huge proportion of housing that is not for sale every year. So you hear 30,300 or 42 gazillion houses built last year. Question, that is the question. The question is how many of those appear as a new house in the Sheridan or DNG or whoever you're having yourself? And the answer is every year it's about 8,000. So the absorption rate that Gavin mentioned, that is the absorption rate. About 8,000 new homes in the market every year. The industry knows well what will sell without affecting the price, without affecting the price. And of course, a large part of this is also councils buying social housing for social use as well. So what you find there then is over years, the new home, proportion of new home comes to market, this is only since 2017, right? Not since 1917, since 2017, has gone from about half of the houses, because remember, one-off housing never comes to the market, it was always council-based and new build, so we never really get 100% coming to the market every year. But it was 48, 49% in 2017, last year it was about 28%. So just over 1 in 4 of all new houses comes to the market for people who like that. And in the city areas, and in Dublin, that is like down to almost zero. Very little. That has huge implications, because what it means is that our home ownership rate has now plummeted. The European average is in green there. Our home ownership rate is 5.7. Just below us is the UK and USA. They are not countries you want to follow in terms of housing policy. We'll all end up living in trailer parks and so on, okay, because we can't afford to own a house, okay. That is not good, and that's the trajectory that we're having. And a lot of the discussion about international capital and all that, you want to see that line go down further. That's the legacy of government places, and the same people in government since here. You know, that to me is their legacy. Now, looking out to look in, this has spatial implications as well, because if you're not building houses where people want to live, where are you going to live? So this used to be 6 or 7 diagrams, and it got down to 1. Now this table here just showing you where people are buying housing. So FTB is the first time buyer, and FOO is what the CSO we call it, former owner occupiers. If you have a house and you're a mover. And you see what's happening is Dublin City, first time buyers, down 70% in the last 6 or 7 years. Movers, down 2/3, then 64%. These are landlords, so they're all down in where's the increase? I keep calling this the Middle East, it's the Middle East. That's up over 200%. That number is actually low, it's up more than 200%. And even first-time buyers buying second-hand homes is up 30% in the Middle East. Former owner-occupiers, they're moving out there too. So people who are working here are moving out here, buying a second car, because our public transport system is not fit for purpose in industry. So a 10-year-old Skoda Octavia, guaranteed it's a 2-litre diesel, okay, or a 3 Series BMW diesel. Out there, he's cycling to the train station, you're heteronormative household, he's cycling to the train station in the morning, he's in work for 9 in the valuations office for 2 years or whatever, she's dropping the kid off at the creche and landing on school. And then what's happening? She's driving into work in the 2-litre diesel. And if you look at the transport studies or the canal studies of who's in what vehicles, it's increasing women on their own. And increasingly they're coming from here, and further coming from Longford and Mullingar and Cavan and everywhere else. I just stop here. There's huge gender implications there about what we're building. If you want to follow people, Sirr in TU Dublin or Savannah in transport infrastructure, there's a report called Walking in Her Shoes, all of this stuff, which is really, really good. So this has huge spatial implications. So for me, in one slide alone, like we could talk for hours about this slide, about what's happening, because what we're building here, where we are, where we're talking about today, is not what people want. It's what investors want. It's what rich people with yachts want. It's what me and old Martin wants as he lives in Cork. But it's not what people want. What people want is somewhere to live. And all the good stuff that comes with that, being able to walk to work, being able to afford to live, having your parents and your wife to help with the kids. That's social network. What you find increasingly is that young people are moving out to the Middle East, followed by their parents. Right, who are traipsing after them and buying a new house out there, selling their house and giving it to Canada or wherever. Traipsing into the middle of nowhere in Mullingar to be near the kids, the son and the daughter having their kids because they need them there, they want them there. That social cohesion, that social network, that support network is now broken, totally broken. You know, and the people who get up early in the morning and leave what agriculture, they're not bankers or people who sort of they're the people who are making your sandwich in Spar or the Daly or in my case in my local butchers or a Clark's bakery or whatever. They're the people who are getting up at 4:30 in the morning to come in to do a day's work on minimum wage. The Dublin bus driver, all those people, it's not the real wealthy Americans. And then you have this nonsense, this is from the Sunday business post the other day. You know, acknowledging this is not a new law, we should be, the government should empower those with capacity to deliver the private sector. Like, this is, I had to look her up, but I kind of vaguely remember, I think she's very clear in the PA, especially those of my day. Not everybody wants to, without any reference to research or anything like that, not everyone in Dublin wants to rent or needs to own their own home. The city's tech-led mobile workforce increasingly demands buildings rent accommodation. Prove it. Prove it to me, right? The Department of Housing's own research shows 86% of those renting want to own their own home. But this is the nonsense that gets tried out all the time, that Neil Martin and et al. Will lack up in the interest of the people. I sound like Citizen Kane, or Citizen Wolfie, or whatever they but you know. So this is the kind of narrative then that comes out. More land needs to be zoned, really? You know, land for over 400,000 houses. We've only built 200,000 since that. 70,000 odd units, as Gavin saying, you know, prime vision will commence. We need more subsidies and viability. It's not viable to build an apartment. Have a look at the basic unit cost and see what it costs to build a two-bed apartment in the country. It's 330,000, not 590,000. Building at scale is the only answer. Not really. There's thousands of SME builder companies out there who would happily plug all the gaps in infill sites and brownfield sites around the place where they can't get access to finance. We are short and insert your own, because everyone over here a number of houses. Supply is the only answer. Supply will bring down prices. Supply has never brought down house prices ever. Bank of England, our own central bank, all say the same thing, and we say the same thing. The builders don't build what prices are called. The only way to judicial reviews are probably know that. Lower standards will make housing more affordable. Again, in the paper 2 weeks ago, why are we putting balconies on the properties? But this is like last year, back like 4 or 8 years ago. Planning is the problem, and only international investment is not the problem. So nobody asks the question, if international investment comes in, what do we want and what will the city look like? And the answer is built around for welcome mobile tech workers, as Malcolm Johnson says. Okay, the politics of the city is quite interesting. You will get that. The politics of the city is quite interesting. Okay, so this all has implications, right? And where you live is hugely important how you vote. Okay, so what I decided to do a few years ago, is go back to 1967, when Ireland was 50% rural and 50% urban. And the blue line is how we've urbanised ourselves. And particularly in Dublin, Dublin is quite an urban place. And the red line and the orange line is how we've ruralised or de-ruralised ourselves. So you can see a kind of a split there. We're going 64, 36. This hugely affects how you vote. So this is the rural line. Here, the rural population, where the percentage, proportion of people living in rural areas going down. And further back, and the famous thing, we all are asking to talk to Ardèche. So it's 650 people in the Ardèche, and the Ardèche is 5 million. Rows of old ladies in the front to swat handling and walkers and all that kind of stuff. And they itemized and and I got up and did this, and they were happy with me. So what you look at then is Fianna Fáil sharing vote. This is the topic down there. Now, I had done it for Fianna Fáil prior to their party thinking, so they knew what was done. And I think Neil wanted to get this message across. But that's the share of Fianna Fáil's first preference votes when you compare that to the rural Ireland and what's happening around. And just to be fair, to be equal to defending, because Neil doesn't like me, that's true in Fine Gael there as well. And they're having the same problem. They're having massive problems in urban areas, and urban areas are where the health problems are. And then there's the, that's Labour, having a similar kind of problem, Labour kind of urban and rural, so they are having similar problems. So, if somebody's losing, somebody's winning, right? So let's look at the urban population. This is the urban population of Ireland, going back way since 1967. So somebody must be winning, everybody else. Now that includes headliners like the Progressive Democrats and Bill Whiteman's, but mostly left-wing parties are in there, right? And just to annoy the Fianna Fáil Irish when I'm looking here today after this, I'll show you Sinn Féin. Okay, with that. And I'm not a member of any party, I spoke to them all. They all like me and they all don't like me at the same time. But that's what's happening, and that's mostly driven by urban areas. Oh, look at this. We updated this yesterday. This is why the presentation was made. Coming to you. 1989, Fianna Fáil had 15 seats in Dublin, now there's 6. Fine Gael had 21, now there's 6. Sinn Féin had none, now there's 8. The Green Party 1, back to 1 after spiking at 8 or whatever it was. Social Democrats not, now 4, Labour 3, now 5, Solidarity, People for Profit 0, now 2. It's fragmenting, and it's kind of going lefty, effectively. Is what's happening. And that's nothing unusual in Dublin about that compared to other cities in the world. But the main parties are having a huge problem, because that's why we keep combining together and creating effectively the dictatorship in Dublin. But in urban areas, they're really struggling. Their core vote is over homeowning voters. With one eye on the funeral home, Sinn Féin's core voters and the other ethnic parties have one eye on the first one. That can't last forever. The funeral home is pretty strong. So their vote is over homeowners. Like during the election, Fianna Fáil and Gael sold people are massive, and Sinn Féin and Labour and everybody wants affordable housing, but nobody wants cheap housing. And that is a real problem. So it's a hugely significant where we live and how we go. And just where we're going to go from here, to the last one, where we're going to go from here, I think in the not too distant future, I think, to be honest with you, we're going to have a city of very haves and very have-nots. It's hugely expensive rentals with the mobility for international tech workers and all those people on huge six-figure salaries, blowing everybody out of the water in terms of rents. And of course, they'll lift the rent caps, they'll do something to the rents as well, the rent pressure zones will live out. And you'll have very poor, overcrowded, cramped conditions, particularly on the north side of the road and that Mountjoy and all those kind of areas there. We're going to have that. We'll have a holiday city, we'll be kind of busy but empty, as Gavin says. Soulless, I see it myself down the Lorcan area, you know. We're going to have fewer and fewer families. There's no schools. You don't want families, because none of the developments that are happening are family friendly. So where people with children who want to have kids, where they're going? Where they're going to go? They're going to go to Mullingar. It's effectively where they're going to go. Cavan, Virginia, and all those kind of places, which are lovely places, but that's not where they want to be, because their families are in the city. Their social network, their support systems in the city. So, like this infrastructure, we're not supplying. We don't want families or like huge waste of investment, things like bus connects, so and metros and all that kind of stuff like that. So we're going to invest gazillions in public transport in the city when everybody else is living in the greater Dublin area and commuting 2-litre diesel slow down days. Like, is that a really wise investment of money? Does that make sense? Really? If we're forcing everybody out and letting them drive everywhere, like, you know, Aaron Ryan was very quiet on this in the last 5 years ago, but I always thought, you know, what's Daryl trying to force people everywhere, you know, out and further out. You know, it's all totally environmentally unfriendly, what's happening. So are we going to, like, you know, what are we doing here? No, there's no mention, like, in transport in the city, everybody driving where they live and people who actually do a great work. We're lacking, the city lacking social community support. The role of housing, council housing in particular, is huge. Council housing is a huge important directly built council housing. Last year, it was 7,500 councils that, you know, Mark claimed that we built council build. Actually, the council only built 1,700. Dublin City Council built how many houses last year? Directly themselves. New houses? 35. The 4 Dublin local authorities managing 200 something, and their waiting list is 24,000. Okay. AHBs are doing heavy lifting, and they're buying up property. That's not the right thing to do. So this kind of role of city, it's all quantity over quality. And the mayor with power and access, we don't have that. There is a concerted effort to own local government. And without powerful local government in the Dublin City Council, you know, and the resources and responsibility, put the responsibility back on the councils to deliver, to do things, but give them the resources and the money, block grants, not going cap and hand for every time you want to build a house to the Department of Housing. And have, you know, a clique of like-minded, you know, middle-aged, middle-class people making all these decisions. Shouldn't be there. And our biggest problem, I think, in Dublin and in the country is the centralisation of power. The power is in the hands of a handful of like-minded, heavily lobbied middle-class people, and they all think in a certain way. And it's a bit of they're not all bad people at all. I was in the department a couple of months ago, very bright and engaged, and kind of know what a lot of the issues are. But when you go up one level, then it's kind of it's a different story. I think. So I'm a bit kind of. Someone called America recently like the most advanced third world country out there. And I kind of think Dublin is the most advanced third world city out there. Like there's some days you kind of love walking to work, and other days you think this is a shanty. You know, and it's a real kind of difficult one to reconcile in your head. You know, the loads of days abroad I live in the south of France, and then you think, well, this kind of walking to work around, you know, the crackdown, Moor Street and all that. So it's a really difficult one to it's like a child that you have that you know you should look at what you like. You know that kind of way. Okay, so we leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Picture painted, plenty of group for Lorcan, and I'd love to hear some solutions too. And a city that people living in families is certainly a thing to worry about. I do one grade of what I talk about is the SMEs. Smaller numbers would be very happy to infill those gaps, and that's certainly going to talk about the city centre and generation. It's about reuse and adaptation, but also goes into to create those opportunities to get people back living, to create the demand for different community facilities and all that. Now, an opportunity to ask some questions. So, if anyone's any questions, I'd like to ask the panel for here for a few minutes. Yeah.
I think I also have a question to ask two speakers. makes a great deal of sense in terms of where money. So you can't hear where money comes from and where money goes to. But what maybe are the three big things that you would like to see moved on, let's say, the next 10 to 15 years?
Those three things you would see.
Movement on in the next 10 to 15 years. In other words, change the future that you have mapped out for us in the last.
Do you want me? Yeah, sorry, you're going to talk about it. I think there's loads of small things. There's loads of small things that need to be done to make the city better. Even down to really basic things like we have a huge proportion of people in Dublin City who rent, and the rent is quite representing the rent from AHB and all that. There is no definition of rent in Irish legislation, for example. Right? So now what you see is people are renting £2 a month, £2.5 a month, and next thing they're getting charged €200 extra every month for the common areas. And the common areas don't have exclusive possession or use over, but yet because there's no definition. Right? So there's those minor things, right? At a structural level, I would like to see Dublin City Council, every local authority, given a cumulatively increasing target of 30% every year based on their last highest ever social housing output, block granted and given the resources to do it and take the department housing out of it. And I would like to see a huge re-emphasis on the development and construction of proper directly delivered local authority housing. I think that's critical. On state lands, we have loads of lands, we have loads of land, there's no shortage of own land, there's no shortage of sites and all that around the place, but I would like to see that.
And would those be for rental, per se?
I actually, to be honest with you, I would see both. And people didn't understand, I think, the Sinn Féin proposal in the last election, whereby they would build housing and they would retain ownership of the land. That is a really, really, really clever thing to do. Tenant purchase, I would do the same, for example, so you can buy a house as a council tenant, but the council is going to retain ownership of the land. So in other words, when you go to sell it, you need to get permission from the council, and the sales price can only be, say, what you paid for it plus 10%, whatever, right? So you retain perpetual affordability. You don't sell someone a house and then 10 years later let them sell it for €1 million when they pay 200,000. That's a waste of state resources. So I think the re-emphasis on direct delivery. I think I would get rid of things like pre-Conahan, those schemes. Like we've so many 9 or 10 schemes coming out there at the moment. Pre-Conahan, like minimum of 40 units per hectare in urban areas and 4 stories. Why the 4 stories? I can give you 80 units per hectare on 3 stories or 2 stories, as any of you clever architects could do in there. I don't think that's outrageous. 3 stories, 80 units per hectare is no problem for a lot of sites. So those kind of things are preventing SMEs, the SMEs from getting involved, because it means they have to build apartments. A lot of SMEs have no experience and can't get funding and finance. I would like to see funding from the government to HPFI, the House Building Finance Ireland, is at market rates. So it's the same rate as an SME builder. I go to HPFI to get funding at the same rate as I would go to an SME finance or go to EIB. That doesn't make sense to me, And I know what the state will say, oh, it's competition, you can't compete with the banks. Well, God damn it, you have to compete. You know what I mean? You can't just sit back on your laurels and say, oh, well, that's the EU competition. Well, not necessarily. Other companies are able to give preferential rates to people doing development for them. So I don't see why I need that.
I think, as I said in my presentation, I spent a lot of time diagnosing the problem, but the solutions are difficult ones because, most people in this room, a lot of people in this room are architects, and by your very nature, you're optimistic people, you're visionary, you like to think about the future, what it will look like, etc. But I do think that, a lot of those graphics I showed, a lot of architect firms are using those graphics as part of the whole process of kind of envisioning the future. And there's no critical understanding, there's no criticism. Like every time you talk about planning on radio, it's never a planner, it's always an economist. We need to change, we need to become more critical of the system that we're working in. And this is difficult for architectural practice because their clients are effectively they're developers and they need to make it up. So my problem is kind of peasants. And I think somebody described the peasant as a realistic optimist. And ultimately, Milton Friedman wouldn't be a great ideological bedfellow myself, but he did get it 100% right where he said only in a crisis actually or perceived produces real change. And a housing crisis, a real housing crisis, something like we experienced 10 years ago, will come. And the ideas which are lying around, we didn't have those ideas. And we had kind of a neoliberal orthodoxy of the kind of German model, which we also took on austerity a few years afterwards. We have to have new ideas lying around. We can't waste the opportunity of the next crisis to create a different kind of one. And we're starting to see cracks emerge in global society. The increasing inequality, the kind of political discontent, etc. All that's happening, a lot of it's driven by housing inequality, people not being able to afford homes, all the stuff that we're talking about, trying to keep them to move all over the country. So I think a crisis will be the opportunity, and we can't wait for the next crisis. So that's not a very optimistic message, but that's all I can say.
I'd like to chip in on it, so I might have been in the wrong panel there, but I think for me, very different subject altogether, but for me, if I had a magic wand, it would be for the next 30 years, the top 30 decision makers in Dublin City Council to live inside the canal, and preferably in the inner city, that's what we define the inner city. Because I think we're still understanding about where people live, huge effects, where decision makers huge effects to planning and priorities of our city. And on very basic issues like rubbish on the streets. I remember having a friend who did live in the inner city telling me at a senior manager meeting a decade ago, and she went up my estimation, and no one said that very point she made. She brought up the subject of rubbish on the streets in the north of the city, and they laughed. They all laughed. All men, all of them, so laughed. And if you have that attitude, and it's still there, you have the attitude of urban living, you can talk a lot about different housing policies, housing solutions, left, Marxist, neoliberal, but I think we're still not taking that issue seriously. And it's a particular issue for Dublin compared to other European cities. A little bit more all of you guys know, but what to live with. I've heard a lot of apartment mentioned here, and a little bit about gentrification, they go along different subject on gentrification. It's a very complicated subject. And I think when you talk about gentrification, obviously housing displacement is a huge issue, but improving areas that people choose not to live in is very important. And too many parts of the city are undesirable to live in, because you just don't have it. And we can't ignore that and label it as something else. I think we're missing something, again, particularly unique to Dublin.
Thank you, sorry. I'm not an architect. My name is Willie White. I live in TU. I work in TU Dublin, and I don't live in the Georgian core, but adjacent to it in Phibsborough, the periphery or whatever that is, between the canals, certainly. And everything people are saying this afternoon resonates with my experience of living in that part of Dublin and my ambition for Dublin. And it looks like we're at the confluence of a polycrisis involving extractive international capitalism, performative anti-urbanism, ideological blindness. So what is the one thing you would say to Micheál Martin, who's a conscientious person, we happen to thank for the smoking ban? What's the one thing you would say to him to cause the scales to fall from his eyes and to understand that the government can deliver this rather than relying on the small landlords, who are also the people we haven't spoken about today, as if they're the solution, or international capital or rights, or which is actually going to Canadian pension funds so that Irish people can't afford to have their own pension. So what's the one thing you would say to effect that change that needs to happen? Get more TVs in Dublin and solve the crisis and have our perpetual gratitude.
Thank you. Two good colleagues, that easy Probably will remember you. I don't know, I think I would really, you look at London and what they have in New York and all that stuff, and then you compare, and there's a huge, it's not just been going on in the last 20 years. One of the fun things I do is supervise PhD students, and part of that actually go on to broad things with them, you look at it all. Housing prices every decade since the 1920s, but it's been referencing the housing crisis. In every decade since the 1920s, there have been attempts by civil servants and politicians to undermine local government in Ireland. They really do not like the idea that somebody else will have power over, instead of the civil servants or politicians or whatever. So I suppose the two things I'd say to me, Mark, wouldn't speak to me more since that performance in the argument, but I'd say two things. One, we can do it ourselves. We have, in 1930, the year my own house was built, we built 17,000 houses in Ireland for a population of 2.9 million. 5,000 of those were houses. Last year we built 17,000 houses. So one first thing that we can do ourselves they only want to do one thing, and that's not the thing. It's absolutely the thing we don't need. The part of housing and research says is the thing we don't need, but get it off the go and do it as a whole. And the second thing I would like to see hugely is a mayor with power. I really think, and I'm kind of skeptical that idea. I think it's going increasingly coming around to the idea that a mayor with power would be really, really good. A mayor that can control. We don't need 47 different organisations and bodies on the timetable for Dublin's the transport system in the Dublin area. We need a mayor with power. We don't need, somebody guard body. We need a mayor with power. You need something that we results. There's a huge issue. I can't remember who said they're gone, but there's something saying, about 40% of the tax goes to the local authorities, and here it's 9% or whatever. That's the kind of power imbalance that keeps DCC and these other local authorities on the leash. And we really shouldn't have that. So I'd like to see a local authority and a Lord Mayor that represents the people, rather than local authorities becoming merely contract administrators, which is one of these, whether it's being proposed and just administer contracts. And I think that's wrong. So mayor with power.
So, the time, I guess we need 10 minutes break. 10 minutes break before we go, and there's the opportunity to discuss this further over coffee. I'd like to thank Paul, Gavin, and for really stimulating afternoon.